Constructive Voices, the podcast for the construction people, with news, views, and expert interviews.
Hello and welcome to the second of two special episodes of Constructive Voices as we bring you our post-COP26 roadmap for the built environment sectors. We held our first event on the 24th of November, and if you haven't listened to the first special episode yet, go back and listen to that first, because you'll hear our Constructive Voices journalist Henry MacDonald talking to Victoria Kate Burrows, Advancing Net Zero Director at the World Green Building Council. Victoria stayed with us to talk to and address questions from our esteemed panel of guests. Panel, welcome. I'll ask each of you to say a little bit about yourself and then ask your question. And so we're going to go, first of all, to Claire Wansbury.
Good morning, and thank you, Steve. So I'm Claire Wansbury. I'm Associate Director of Ecology at Atkins, which is a major worldwide engineering and environment consultancy. We work a lot on big infrastructure projects, but all sorts of schemes across the world. I'm particularly focused on the UK. And as an ecologist, hello, Victoria, I've got a biodiversity focused question for you. The background to the question is something you touched on when you were speaking earlier, the fact that we're living in a time of global emergencies of climate change and biodiversity loss. And those two issues are intertwined. If we try and solve one, we'll fail for ourselves and the world if we ignore the other. And the path to net zero is an essential one for us to follow. But it's part of wider action that's needed to respond to these emergencies. And in relation to biodiversity, for anyone on the call who's not really thought about the challenges there, what's going on globally through human action is literally a mass extinction event. So something our planet hasn't experienced since the time the dinosaurs became extinct. And that's an incredibly daunting challenge, but obviously it's a time where there's also opportunities to take action that can turn areas from being nature poor to nature rich. So with all of that, where we need to move quickly into a phase where we're reducing harm to nature, but also actively restoring it, I'd love to hear your thoughts on how those working in the built environment can make a positive contribution.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Claire. Lovely to meet you. And thank you for your question. I'm so pleased that you brought biodiversity into this conversation. I mean, the Global Green Building Council movement has for in some cases decades operated with different rating tools and different schemes and frameworks that have incorporated biodiversity. Some might call it ecological value in the case of the BRE and BREEAM. And in this shift to more positive impacts from projects, it's really having its moment, I think, because we are asking developments and buildings not only to think about at a building level the impact of the buildings on the biodiversity of the site itself, but also how it can contribute to that positive impact. And if we're going to be developing buildings, then we need to also be enhancing communities and biodiversity as well. Addressing emissions from the buildings or from the built environment can help drive the Sustainable Development Goals, not just the Climate Action Goal, but I think around 11 of the 17 goals can be directly impacted from taking action in the built environment, such as low carbon energy transition, enhancing nature, supporting adaptation and resilience. And so over the past few decades, as the Green Building Councils have really worked to try and embed that within some of their tools, we've seen some brilliant outcomes. And it is, it is incorporated into so many of those various tools. Even though we have specific tools at the moment that focus on carbon, they are often embedded within wider conversations that include biodiversity. And one of my favorite examples is in Singapore. The Park Royal on Pickering in Singapore. Singapore has a Green Mark certification scheme. They've all got slightly different names. The one in Singapore is called Green Mark. And they give recognition on when you replace the footprint of the building to a certain ratio of greenery within the space. So, it's kind of driving the garden city of Singapore, that buildings aren't just built on their footprint, the space where they're being built, but they replace the amount of land they've used within the space itself. And that's why you see trees on roofs and within the spaces and lovely green walls and things like that, and really enhancing nature, roof gardens, sort of kitchen gardens, natural gardens, sort of really enhancing the biodiversity as well. Park Royal on Pickering, it's within Green Mark, they apply points, or they kind of recognize when a building replaces the ratio of up to 6:1. So the space that it's taken, its footprint of the building, replacing 6 times that with green space within the building itself. And so on a scale of from 1:1 up to 6:1, it gives you that points. You get more points towards your certification scheme. Park Royal and Pickering achieved a ratio of 12:1. So they went beyond even what was set as a requirement, which was going beyond what they needed to do as part of that development. And again, I sort of reinforced the setting the question, right? Saying, what can we do with this building to enhance biodiversity? How can we use this community to create green spaces and incorporate biodiversity more than ever before? Our relationship with buildings is changing. The impact of our buildings on our health and our need to engage with green spaces is absolutely happening in real time. So I think this will become an even more prevalent part of the conversation. But it shows that it's possible if the right questions are asked. So I guess the answer to my question is hopefully, increasingly, and we need to rise to this challenge. It's a complete transformation we need in the way that we design and build buildings, and we're seeing more and more of these concepts coming into that consideration too.
Brilliant. Victoria, thank you very much, and thank you, Claire, for your question as well. Next, let's introduce Dr. Darshil Shah. Morning, Darshil.
Thank you. And nice to meet you, Victoria. I'm Darshil Shah. I'm an associate professor in materials at the Department for Architecture at the University of Cambridge, and I'm also a material scientist researcher at the Centre for Natural Material Innovation, where our focus is on embodied emissions from the built environment, and particularly how we may be able to use plant-based materials like engineered timber, bamboo, hempcrete, and hemp and linen-based materials, for example, and other biomaterials as alternatives to both structural, non-structural materials in the built environment, particularly concrete, steel, and some plastics as well. So my question for you, Victoria, is with COP27 in a year's time and the ongoing, in the UK, the Environmental Audit Committee's inquiry into the sustainability of the built environment, what actual practical steps should governments be taking to promote the greater use of biomaterials? And if you think they are really the solution?
As a programme at World Green Building Council, as I say, we needed to shift from green buildings that do a bit less bad to decarbonising buildings, and we focused on operational carbon first. And then we published a report called Bringing Embodied Carbon Up Front in 2019, which was really trying to bring a really strong emphasis or greater awareness around the challenge of embodied carbon, because there's a time factor to this, right? You can build a building, or you can improve the way an existing building performs operationally. You can't do anything about the emissions that went into building that building. So whilst we are continuing to build all these new buildings, we need to be taking account of the emissions that go into building them in the first place. What we call for in the report is greater access and availability to low carbon material options. So that means in the short term, looking at what's available and including things like bio-based materials in terms of meeting that requirement for buildings with lower carbon alternatives, but also for the heavy industries to decarbonize their production processes so that they are on carbon terms equivalent. We can't sort of simply not build buildings, but we also can't simply not build buildings with concrete or steel either. So there's a kind of dual call for action there. So if countries did want to favour a particular material over another, they could create procurement criteria for bio-based materials. I don't know if you've seen the one from France. France is set to require that all new public buildings must be made from at least 50% from wood or from other sustainable materials from 2022, as it's pushing for a more kind of sustainable urban development model. And they've already pledged a greater use of natural materials such as wood, straw, and hemp, and that other buildings any higher than 8 stories that are being built for the Paris Olympics in 2024 must be made entirely of timber. So there are governments out there that are recognizing that certainly in the short term, there needs to be some more responsible and sustainable methods of construction from materials, that there is a role for bio-based materials. But we also recognize the need to champion for that in addition to decarbonisation of heavy industries, that there's still that sustainable model, because the transition to entirely bio-based materials would present other challenges too.
I have a follow-on question, not related to biomaterials, but related to education and training, because you did mention training as well. And I wondered, what the role of education might be in decarbonizing the built environment.
Absolutely. So I'm a former architecture student myself, right? And it's really because of my degree at Nottingham University incorporating environmental design into the degree that led me on this path into my career. But it was an additional module as part of, a course that you had to opt into, right? And those students that I was on that course with then are now designing today's buildings that will be built in 2030. We design to the standards of today, but the buildings might not be finished until 2030. And by then our kind of standards of what we expect are likely to have changed. So education is a huge part of this challenge, both from the kind of early stages of architecture design students and engineers, into the kind of retraining or re-emphasis of the sorts of shifts we need from the existing building stock. And there's a lot of work across the climate curriculum being applied across universities and professional bodies, because we need to bring this language into every single project that is happening across the world. It's extremely important. It does require a massive shift in the priorities and the way that buildings have been designed in the past. We've inherited a stock of buildings that aren't fit for the future. So as you say, they need to be renovated and improved. Some of the schemes that offer grants for installation of different technologies, particularly within the UK, but across other countries as well, haven't had the sort of uptake that you would really hope for. But where there has been really strong levels of applications in terms of accessing those grants, the actual delivery and the execution of those projects as a percentage was quite low. And that highlights to us a skills gap that really needs to be addressed if we're going to address both how new buildings are designed, but also how existing buildings are renovated and optimized. That's a huge opportunity there for the market.
Victoria, thank you very much. And thank you, Darshil, for your question as well. Darshal's a previous guest on the Constructive Voices podcast. So if you go back, you will find his episode there. It's well worth a listen. Next, with a question, we're welcoming another of our panelists, Vicente Wyatt. Morning.
Good morning. As you may know, I was chief architect of the city of Barcelona during 4 years. You see the mantra that we wrote here in the year 2011, Barcelona will be a self-sufficient city, etc., in a zero emissions metropolis. So I would say that this mantra was for me very clear since many years ago, and now it's very good that the European Union somehow has defined this new standard to become zero emissions. About what Victoria said, there is something that I am worried, because she says something that the net zero is a journey. Net zero is a number. It's like when you are in the, let's say, a speed regulation in a highway, to have 120 kilometers per hour is the limit. And if you are above that limit, is something you will be punished. So that means that today, what happened, I think, is that we come from a culture about sustainability that is very wide and very open and very, I would say, good intentions, but without clear numbers. And the good thing about the net zero is that it's defining a good number. So I think that Henry did a very good comment on, can we do a standard for the net zero? And the answer is yes, for sure. I think that, Victoria, and this is for you, I think that your explanation has been very honest, but I will tell you the truth. I has never been a great fan on the Green Building Council. The impact of for example, the LEED certification in Barcelona is very low, because you need to pay a lot of money to get a certification. And that means that only luxury buildings are only able to do that, because in order to do some marketing. So the question is, the Green Building Council is thinking to review their standard that has been the standard for the last years in order to transform the net zero in the real standard, not in a journey? This will be my question.
So thank you very much for your question, and really useful to hear your insights. So thank you for that. I'm not sure what the current number is. I think it's around 14 green building councils that have launched zero carbon certifications for their buildings. I don't think GVC España is one yet, but we can find out if they're working on one, again, because of, I think you've touched on the issues that I mentioned earlier about how, having a global standard is challenging because you need the local applications and really help to understand what the local requirements are. All of those zero carbon or net zero carbon certifications from the green building councils are performance based, which is the difference to sort of historically green building councils and green building rating schemes that are very prescriptive, which is really useful in terms of increasing knowledge awareness, encouraging a building to consider a project team to consider enhancing biodiversity, for example. They may not have considered that before, but if they're required to achieve a level of certification under a green building standard, then it asks them to consider it within their project. And that's really the intention of those programs. So over the past, 5 years since Advancing Net Zero has been at World Green Building Council, we've been encouraging GBCs to think about how they can incorporate the net zero concepts into their schemes. So LEED Zero, for example, does not require you to achieve LEED Platinum, but it requires you to achieve some level of LEED certification so that you consider that whole holistic approach, but that you also achieve on a performance basis based on your metered data of how the building actually performs a net zero emissions balance over the course of a year. So we're really, again, seeing that shift, that transition, that a green building standard wasn't enough, and now we need to be moving towards the net zero terminology. And again, the local green building councils are supporting in what that means for the different markets. Within Europe, there's more of a focus because of the European Commission, the Energy Performance of Buildings Declaration, and now Sustainable Performance of Buildings Declaration, that these things are coming into policy more quickly than in other countries. And so the focus of the green building councils in Europe is advocacy around responding to and calling for regulations to be increased within particular markets at the European level, Victoria, but also at the country.
Thank you. And are you thinking to reduce the fees in order to get the certification, in order to be able to use that money for the building itself? Because to do a zero emission building costs more money than the startup buildings. And that means that people might decide if they want to put more timber in the building or they want to get a certification. So how is connected the idea of getting certification that costs a lot of money in relation with the extra investment that you need to do in order to do the zero emissions building?
Sure. I mean, the certification fees is very much a local green building council question, I'm afraid. But for us, it's about the performance. It's not our call to action for the industry is not all buildings in the world to be certified. It's all buildings in the world to perform at zero carbon. So that's, for the various project teams to determine. Some organizations and projects really value the certification. Sometimes it's a requirement of policy. But for us, it's about the outcome. It's that those decisions have been made at the right stages of the project process, and that you're achieving a zero carbon building, whether it's certified or not.
Victoria, thank you. And Vicente, thank you so much for your questions as well. Next, let's welcome Dr. Wendy Jones. Wendy, morning.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for inviting me along. I'm a chemist by training, but I've worked in across the sort of academic industry interface for many, many years. I'm not just a parent, I'm a grandparent as well. Working with Neil for the last couple of years to try and see how we can influence the industry to reduce plastic. And we're doing this a few ways, just very quickly. Looking at engineering changes in the ways of working within the industry. We've got some interesting partnerships developing. We're talking to companies about developing plastic audits for them to help them to look at what their plastic is. But one of the easy wins, obviously, is looking at waste and offcuts. And we want to look at new and sustainable options, alternatives to plastic, where that's feasible. We all know that plastic's very valuable in many ways in its functionality, but there's lots of issues with the disposal of it. What I'd like to ask really is that office and home users have got incredibly used over the last 50 years to on-tap heating, wiring, plastic goods, all the things that you see in your kitchen, your bathroom, and all the rest of it, and the ability to replace these fixtures and fittings almost at will, whether it be office redesign, whether it be home redesign. I was interested on comments about the required level of change, and also what Pete was just saying about the way we live is changing, or the ways we live are changing. But my question, I suppose, is, do you think time has come for a change in our attitudes, not just within the industry, but how the consumers of the construction industry, so to speak, operate? You know, whether we need a sea change in our attitudes to how we live in our buildings.
Yeah, thank you so much for your question, Wendy. I think you're right. I think it has to be the time to change. There simply isn't an alternative. You know, we've been talking here about the huge potential, but also the complexity of the sector. This really isn't an overnight change. It's something that has to be embedded in the way that we design and construct and operate our buildings, from, you know, major real estate portfolios to our homes, and that just simply isn't an option for us to continue in the way that we have been. If you ask anyone on the street what they can do to reduce their carbon footprint, they'd probably tell you that they stop flying so much, they might eat less meat, they maybe will cut down on their plastic consumption. But collectively, the impact of addressing emissions from the built environment really is enormous and outweighs some of those issues. So it's all about it becoming something within the mindset of consumers. Inherently, the way that our buildings are designed, constructed, and operated is extremely wasteful. And you know, some things like smart meters, or you know, the way that the energy companies are now supplying us our consumer information around what our consumption habits are, will help towards that. But it really feels like the built environment needs its single plastic moment, right? The same way that people are sort of carrying around their coffee mugs, and their sort of reusable coffee mugs, and their reusable plastic or their reusable water bottles, instead of using plastic, and really making that conscious shift. The same needs to happen for the built environment. And as we say, that goes from policymakers and, you know, commercial asset owners and operators, all the way down to your average homeowner. And so it really does feel like that shift's needed. Now, the Green Building Council movement and the green building movement in general has been calling for improvements to energy efficiency standards for decades. You know, particularly within Europe and North America, this has been an issue. This is not a new issue. It's something that's been called for years. There's been people who have dedicated their entire lives to this, and yet we still don't have regulation that is good enough in terms of energy efficiency. And as I said earlier, it means that buildings and homes are being built to insufficient, in some cases, woefully inadequate levels of standards that will not serve society in the future. And that is a big challenge, but it is more than a carbon challenge. That's a social challenge. That's a social problem that the governments and policymakers have contributed to. For us, you know, we are talking to the businesses, to the policymakers, but you know, it's the people who live in leaky homes and have to experience fuel poverty each winter that, you know, if we manage to convert CEOs and businesses to make their real estate assets net zero, then we won't have done our jobs if people still are living in leaky homes, right? So if we're not able to convince governments and the homeowners based on the kind of sort of very technical carbon emissions and energy efficiency data, or the kind of all the different initiatives that we try to improve people's insulations in their homes and change their boilers, you know, how do we convince them? Right, that's kind of what is the narrative, and how does that need to change, whether we're talking to a minister or a mayor or a CEO or a homeowner. And I think the big shift is coming through health, right? Through the COVID pandemic, you know, as I said earlier, the relationship to the spaces that we occupy and our health is changing. People will undoubtedly reconsider their choices of where they live now, as to Pete's point. But I think understanding how our buildings affect our health, particularly when we choose to spend, well, either voluntary or involuntary, spend so much time in them is really significant. Last week, there was a report specifically now to England. There was a new report called The Cost of Poor Housing in England from the UK GBC and from the Building Research Establishment. They found that 11% of homes in the UK, 2.6 million homes, so imagine how many people that affects, are classified as poor quality. And that costs the NHS £1.4 billion a year in terms of the health impacts that brings. And 50% of that is due to the exposure of residents to excess cold. And we've created that as a sector, right? We've created those homes. Obviously, the climate is changing, the extreme of temperatures is changing. We get equally with a problem in winter, but we also have problems in summer with extreme heat, especially in France where I live. But fixing that as an issue will pay back in 7 years and bring £15 billion of savings. So if we can't convince people on the climate, on the carbon agenda, or on the energy efficiency piece, then, I think bringing health into that conversation and people really understanding how the choices they make at home, the energy they use, the goods that they buy, it's all very kind of down the road, isn't it? In terms of you can't see it, it's very difficult when it's out of sight to really quantify what that means. But we're seeing carbon footprinting on our flights, on our foods, on our homes. Now these sorts of statistics can't be ignored. And now with the increasing awareness of impact of our surroundings on our health, I think it's going to be much more insight in mind. That's my hope in any case, Wendy.
Air quality is one of those things as well, I think.
Air quality, yeah, absolutely. So if you're in a house, I won't use this one because we renovated it, so hopefully it's a bit better. The house next door, let's say, a little bit leaky, it means that you're losing the heat that you're paying for in the winter, but it also means that you're kind of receiving air into the home that might not be of great quality. In offices and schools, some buildings will have monitors to monitor on a regular basis the quality of the air. And there are systems, of course, with filters, like active systems, to make sure that the air is a high level of quality. And actually, the level and the condition, the quality of the air can affect productivity. It can affect sleep. It can affect all sorts of things throughout our entire lives. So there's a bit of a conversation happening in the industry at the moment because of the situation we're experiencing with the COVID pandemic and the need to change the air within the spaces, particularly within public spaces and in hospitals and things like that, and offices, that's more energy intensive because we have to constantly change the air. And yet it is for the benefit of health. So it's a constant kind of play off, but it doesn't necessarily mean less efficient. You can still do that quite efficiently. The concept of what we consider under health or under the topic of health is also broadening into more of a conversation about social value. So in terms of green buildings, in the past, we might have considered health to be purely about indoor air quality or the amount of daylight that you get or the sound quality. But now it's really extending into that social value of the benefits and the conditions of the workforce on a construction site or the supply chain and how the materials have actually made it to the project that you're spending a lot of money on. So there's a huge, I think we can have a whole nother session, Stephen and Pete, about health and well-being and how our buildings affect our health. There's a huge amount to consider there.
Brilliant. Victoria, thank you so much. And Wendy, thank you for your questions as well. Now, one of our favourite episodes so far of the Constructive Voices podcast is our Women in Construction episode. And good to see so many women in construction at this event today. But one of those who took part in that very interesting discussion with Henry is with us today on our panel. Sumele Aruafor, hello, welcome.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me. A pleasure listening to everyone and all the insights that you've shared. So I'm Sumele Aruafor. I'm an associate member of the Royal Institute of British Architects, and I am passionate about building performance design. I apply my passions in my role as a senior strategic marketing manager at Trimble's SketchUp, the 3D modeling tool. And I create content and campaigns that enable AEC professionals to leverage technologies that will then help them design a more sustainable built environment. And Trimble solutions kind of support that. We deliver insights that solve physical world problems in like the construction sector, agriculture, geospatial, and transportation. Anyway, some context for my question for Victoria. So the impact of, the built environment's embodied and operational emissions is unavoidable. It's just there, right? It's a chunky number. And we as architects and professionals in the AEC industry are uniquely positioned to positively impact the day-to-day of people, communities, economies, and the entire global climate. And I feel like we all have the responsibility to go beyond minimum, right? Like just like Victoria has been outlining. And so your feedback and your insights from COP26 is encouraging. I've seen summaries from people like Ed Mazria at Architecture 2030, some of our customers like Patrick Thibodeau, people who are actually on the ground doing the work daily. But not everyone is on board, right? So my question is how quickly can the urgency, the global urgency that we all feel around climate change, how can that spark a collective transformation in the way that AEC professionals, particularly architects, how can it spark a change that causes them to embrace the innovative technology that's out there and the diversity of thought that is required to actually deliver that more sustainable built environment? And if there's anything that we can do, what can be done to bring that change about more rapidly?
Okay, huge question. Thank you, Stacey. I think, and I'm fortunate to have some experience, as I mentioned, myself, from sort of previous roles as advising as a sustainable design consultant on, the types of projects that you're talking about. And my kind of, I guess, dream being a sustainable design consultant would be that there was not a future for a sustainable design consultant, that every project wouldn't need someone else sitting around the project table, right? That this is embedded into what the architects, engineers, everyone involved in that project team is working towards. And I think that's what net zero can do. And the AEC community, you kind of have two choices, right? You can wait for regulation to require the projects to deliver against enhanced performance and wait for the clients to set the brief, or you can use every project as an opportunity to educate the clients to kind of reset the standards, right, of what needs to be done, because inevitably your briefs that you'll be receiving now will not be for net zero buildings. And the companies that we work with under the commitment and more broadly within the Green Building Council community and for example organizations that sit on World GBC's corporate advisory board see it as their duty to educate clients as to what can be done. So again, adopting that brief, saying, okay, I hear what you're asking for, here's what we can deliver you. And we've heard stories about companies or engineers saying that we will offer a net zero design at no extra cost to our client, no matter what the brief says. It's our duty to hear your brief and give you back a net zero design for that brief, right? Or a dual design that says we're going to design with the materials that you think you want, and we're also going to design at our cost the design a lower embodied carbon option. I'm thinking of an airport project in Cebu in the Philippines. This client in particular wanted a kind of undulating wavy roof design, and the architects from Hong Kong designed an option in timber and also one within steel and concrete. When it came down to it, the client went for the timber option because of the constructability, the buildability of it. In the program, by the time it would take to build this building, it was typhoon season, the kind of setting for time for the concrete, the scaffolding implications, it wasn't an option. So they actually went for the lower embodied carbon option, not because of the lower embodied carbon implication, but because of the buildability of that project. So it's extremely powerful to take that role on as an educator to clients, right, and show what's possible. I could talk about this for ages. I'm going to try not to, Steve. But for me, what we're seeing is that it's no longer the responsibility of just the architect to deliver the client a net zero building. It's not a case of the architect designs, the kind of the initial design, hands that to an engineer to make it net zero. It's everyone's collective responsibility. And setting a target on a project is really powerful because it makes everyone contribute towards achieving that project, and understanding the impact of even the structural engineer of, you know, how this building is going to be built when you're starting to consider carbon targets for that project. And there's a few contractual changes that we're seeing as well that helps with this. Like usually within the UK, you'd appoint the architect, who would then appoint the engineer, would then appoint the contractor, and so on. Whereas in the US, there's much more collaborative models that say everybody comes together at the same time. And then everyone gets a kind of profit and loss share in how close we are to achieving the outcomes of that project once you're sort of a year into the operations. So you're actually focused on how the building will actually perform at the end of it. So I think that collective responsibility, the collective obligation of the sector to educate clients before the regulation is here, and it's coming, I promise, will help both position yourselves, but also the clients, to make sure that that the buildings are set up for the future. And this target being based on whole life carbon, as I mentioned earlier, helps sort of separate the concepts of capital cost and whether something costs more. Net zero should not cost more, versus whether you will receive that benefit for the lifetime of that building, and what you are contributing to the world in terms of that built asset. Will that built asset contribute to the world in 60 years' time, not just today?
So would you say that by showcasing these possibilities, that more and more professionals will take it on? I mean, if you've worked with multiple team members, stakeholders across like engineering and building and design, and they've experienced the best of what we can deliver as a profession today, and then you work with another architect and they're not thinking about it, do you think that will spur on more and more of us to take it on and actually jump and do the work that needs to be done to get to more sustainable building?
Absolutely. I think I can't remember who mentioned this, whether it was Henry or Neil, but the sector is notoriously resistant to change, right? And so, you know, any of those kind of just sort of small, what if we did this or what if we did that, and kind of just constantly questioning the business as usual, then, you know, it helps unlock ideas and solutions that might not have been considered if you just sort of continued on the path of least resistance, if you like, that people are used to.
Victoria, thank you very much. Shimali, thank you very much for your excellent questions as well. And we're going to, obviously, we've been focusing on the construction industry. That is what we focus on Constructive Voices. But Sangeeta Waldron joins us now. And I know your focus, Sangeeta, is about all types of business.
It is. Thanks, Steve. Thank you, Victoria. I've really enjoyed a lot of the conversation. I've also learnt a lot, and I feel heartened by some of the things you've said. So I'm author of a book called Corporate Social Responsibility is Not Public Relations, and it's letting all businesses know, irrespective of sector, that authentic corporate social responsibility needs to now be baked into the business strategy and the brand, because corporate social responsibility is the future of the world of business. So my question, Victoria, and forgive me because you might have touched on some of these already, but at COP26, Prince Charles talked about private corporations really leading in this fight against climate change, and that we need them to be investing in renewable energies. We need them to be investing in technology. So how do we get more global businesses in the global construction sector to actually scale up quicker? Because we don't really have decades to get this done. We're running out of time. And is there a way to do it where those companies that are greenwashing are not being authentic with their builds and, you know, their purpose? Can we actually penalize them like we do at the Hague when people are creating international crime? Can we do something like that where it's not just based on goodwill and people being encouraged, but we're actually penalizing people, we're making it mandatory? So that's my question.
Yeah, we've mentioned a little bit about the private sector and the kind of role, the obligation of the private sector to really be leading this charge. And I do think it's a necessary part of that process, of that component. The private sector has to demonstrate what's possible. We cannot simply wait for regulation. We've been waiting far too long for regulation to kick in. It is an extremely complex area, and naturally policymakers have all sorts of different priorities and obligations. There are cities that are moving faster in terms of city level policies, which is a good sign. So if you are a business wanting to build in that city, you have to do more than if you were going to build in a different city or a different part of that same country. I think from a corporate social responsibility point of view, it used to be something that would potentially provide competitive edge. And now it's becoming even more of an obligation that actually, if you don't have CSR or you don't have transparent reporting of your impacts, then, why not? It's sort of a really, really questionable. World Green Building Council published at COP a report that we called Beyond the Business Case. We set out to kind of refresh our business case report, which was called the Business Case for Green Buildings from 2013. So it's in desperate need of refreshing from all the reasons that we've talked about today: broadening scope, increased urgency. We set out to write this report because we thought we were going to have to convince the world that it might cost more, but that there's other things like social value and expectations of the public that means that you should be considering this anyway, that you should be investing in a sustainable built environment. And ultimately what we produced was a report that says there is irrefutable evidence for the broader value proposition for a sustainable built environment, that you can't afford not to invest in a more sustainable built environment, because we found that the drivers for the business case were increasing, that the business case is getting stronger, but then there is also drivers for social value and the social value case as well. And it is less about whether you're doing it, whether you're doing something, whether it's CSR reporting or ESG or setting targets. It's the risk of not doing it and the risk mitigation consideration against future trends or even existing trends that we expect to continue, like policy change, for example, and like carbon pricing. There's a huge section in the report on carbon pricing that is effectively what you're talking about here in terms of penalizing, because if organizations are just tracking or are just seeming to track and not taking action to reduce, then they ultimately will feel that when carbon pricing comes in. And what we're seeing is organizations already setting internal carbon taxes to really hold themselves to account. Different departments almost in competition with each other about who can build a building with a lower carbon impact because of the implications on a carbon tax that might go into an internal carbon fund and then be used to invest in more sustainable development projects or outside of their own boundary, for example. So again, we're definitely seeing it happen, but it's far too few. It needs to really ramp up. And what this report says, that at the risk of an imminent carbon pricing model or a carbon tax model, then it's something you can't afford not to do. And again, that's how we're seeing the narrative shift. We used to be asked a lot about the business case. We're asked a lot less. Well, that's why we did this report. Now that we've published it, we're asked a lot less about the business case, because it seems like it's just becoming, embedded, that it's just something that has to be done. And in fact, you'll be asked more about why you've chosen not to do it than given kudos for choosing to do it, if that makes sense.
Thank you, it does. Yes. I think we've just got a long way to go still, because we're relying a lot on goodwill, and we just need people to do it. We just need businesses to be better in what they're doing.
I think the more that we can prove it through the various case studies and sort of the anecdotal evidence of organizations who are living this. I mean, I think to Samele's point earlier, we're seeing from the commitment, companies who are taking it upon themselves, like design and engineering firms who are taking it upon themselves to carry out the carbon footprinting calculations for their clients to be able to inform them better. It's being equipped with that knowledge, right? Do you realize that if you change this design, if you add more glazing to this building, this is the impact it will have on your building? And that can happen now real time in project meetings, which is extremely powerful. So it's really increasing that in terms of knowledge, being able to quantify it and having that data to be able to say, we can model this for you. The report that I mentioned includes a future scenario modeling section that sets out basically under different scenarios of the IPCC report, a 1.5 degree scenario or a 3 degree scenario, that even in a 1.5 degree scenario, there will still be impacts from extreme weather on buildings and infrastructure, and that sustainable assets are going to be more resilient with lower costs from those climate impacts. So there really isn't a situation where it doesn't make sense not to invest. And that's starting to come through from investors already, which is, where it needs to come from, really.
Brilliant. Victoria, thank you so much. And Sangeeta, thank you for your question as well. Now, we have heard so much from our panellists and from Victoria. I'm sure that Henry MacDonald has at least one more question to ask, having heard everything we've heard today, Henry.
Yes. I was interested in when she mentioned the pandemic, because one of the byproducts of the pandemic is working from home. Millions of workers are not going to return to buildings. That might be a permanent feature of the world of work, which means lots of empty buildings in cities all over the planet. Will that enable building recycling, or what impact do you think it will have environmentally?
Yeah, so I guess two big considerations there, right? First of all is what we do with homes. Because of the consumption of homes, the carbon footprinting of organizations will be focused on their real estate assets and what they can control in terms of their commercial real estate portfolio, which is often, completely different in terms of performance and efficiency compared to homes. The world stopped. We stopped traveling. We stopped commuting. We were all working from home. And yet emissions barely changed. They came down by maybe 10, 12%. That's because we were still using buildings, right? And we were using different buildings. We just moved our operations. So there is definitely, a challenge there from what we do about the residential stock. If more people are going to be using their homes more during the week compared to the kind of typical usage and consumption profile, then there's the challenge of what we do with the buildings that are within the cities, how we can repurpose those, how we can ensure that they're still attractive for people to come into work, again, from a health point of view, making buildings sort of more commutable to, and different modes of transport to be able to get to office, and desirable, right, to travel to, and people want to choose to spend that time within their offices. If given the option of flexibility, ultimately we want people to choose to be able to work in those spaces. So I think there'll definitely be a change in that profile. It's now how we address that in terms of the emissions, and if necessary, how we can look to repurpose those buildings if they will no longer be used for their intended purpose. And of course, we're seeing examples of that popping up all over the place.
What happens to those buildings that may be permanently unoccupied? Do they need to be shut down in order not to be emitting energy emissions, all that?
Yeah, so I think one of the reasons that emissions didn't come down as much was because those buildings were empty, but still using energy, right? They're still kind of locked into a consumption or a kind of programmed consumption pattern that meant that they were still being, heated and lit in terms of the internal services. If those buildings really have no future, I can't really imagine a scenario where they would have absolutely no future. We've got buildings in Folkestone, where I am at my parents', that are being repurposed already because the occupiers of those buildings shut down. And there's all sorts of creative ways that these spaces are being reused as kind of needs to be. I guess if there really is a scenario where a building is completely closed but has no future as a building, then the option for that really is to kind of consider, as we were talking earlier about circular economy, this concept of buildings as material banks. Like, those materials are there, those assets are there, and how can they be repurposed? How can buildings be deconstructed, not demolished, but deconstructed, and as many materials recovered as possible to be reused? Some of the International Olympic Committee projects for future Olympics build in what they call legacy, and that kind of makes you kind of really think about buildings as a product rather than as an asset, as a useful product that can still be used. The legacy projects of the Olympics say, we need to build this huge stadium for a time, but only for a limited time. How can we then deconstruct part of the stadium and repurpose that somewhere else? And so that concept of repurposing buildings, maybe not as buildings, the asset itself, but maybe the breaking that down and the materials or the systems or the components of that building for use somewhere else that would be more constructive if that was the ultimate outcome.
Victoria, thank you so much. Before we finish, and because we've had so much of your time, I think it's only fair, as you've answered so many questions from other people, just to say, is there anything you want to say without a question, just anything you might want to add to close the session?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I've tried to incorporate as much as what I want to say within my answers, but we did leave COP26 hopeful. We did everything we possibly could to make sure that this sector is recognised as a critical solution to the climate crisis. So we've done our part, as it were, at COP. We are on those stages championing for this sector as a solution, and that means that we now need to step up as an industry, the practitioners, to do the things that we say are possible, that we're hearing are possible from the majority of the stakeholders. There are some challenges, we've been challenged today on some of the kind of remaining barriers within the sector, but they are decreasing all the time. And ultimately, it becomes a choice. It becomes a choice whether to build a resource-intensive project or a choice to build something that is fit for the future. And we're constantly seeking to help the industry overcome those barriers, to understand what challenges you're facing. So if you are working on projects and you're on the ground and you're hearing the same thing over and over again from your clients, tell us, because we want to hear that. We want to know why. Why is it that we sort of pitch at COP26 and at these sort of big high-level meetings that this is a solution and an opportunity, and yet it's not. We're hearing on the ground that it's still not happening in the scale and the level that it should be. Like, we need to hear that so that we can help you overcome them.
And that brings us to the end of our second special episode of Constructive Voices. Our event on the 24th of November was certainly one not to be missed, but if you did miss it, well, at least you've been able to catch up here on the podcast. We have a lot of special events lined up for 2022. I know you won't want to miss them. The best way to keep in touch is to sign up for our newsletter, which you can do at constructive-voices.com. Don't forget the dash, constructive-voices.com. And of course, keep listening to the podcast, because we'll tell you when those events are coming up as well. Subscribe or follow to get these episodes automatically using your favourite podcast app. And until next time, thanks for listening. You're really helping us build something.